The first time I kissed him, it wasn't love. It was survival. The rain hit Manhattan like it had something to prove, slamming against glass and pavement until the whole city blurred into streaks of light and noise, and I was running through it, heels slipping, lungs burning, knowing if I slowed down even once they would catch me, and I couldn't let that happen, not after everything I had already seen. The hotel lobby doors burst open behind me, warm air and polished marble replacing the cold chaos of the street, but safety didn't follow me inside. It never did, and I could still feel them, those footsteps, measured and relentless, cutting through the noise like they knew exactly where I was going before I did. I didn't think, I didn't plan, I just moved, weaving past a couple arguing in low voices, past a bellhop frozen mid-step, straight toward the only place that looked like it might buy me a few seconds. An elevator tucked behind a private corridor, the kind you weren't supposed to use unless you belonged there. The doors slid open too easily, like a mistake waiting to happen, and I stepped inside just as my reflection caught up with me. Soaked hair, shaking hands, fear written in every line of my face, and then I saw him. He stood already inside, still as if the storm outside didn't exist, dressed in a black suit that looked like it had never known rain, never known anything out of place, his eyes lifting from whatever thought he'd been holding on to and landing on me with a kind of quiet attention that made everything else fade for half a second. The doors began to close, but not fast enough because I heard them, voices closer now, sharp and controlled, the kind that didn't need to be loud to be dangerous, and I knew I had maybe 3 seconds left to decide what kind of mistake I was about to make. He didn't ask who I was. He didn't move to stop me. He just watched. So I stepped forward, grabbed the front of his jacket like it was the only solid thing in a collapsing world, and kissed him. Not gently, not carefully, but with the kind of urgency that comes from knowing this is it. This is the line between being seen and being overlooked, between being taken and being ignored. And, for a second I forgot everything except the fact that he didn't push me away. The elevator doors opened again with a soft chime, and I felt the air shift as the men reached the threshold, hesitation flickering just long enough to matter, just long enough for the lie to take shape, and then his hands settled at my waist, steady, deliberate, as if he'd decided something I didn't yet understand. The doors closed again. Silence rushed in, heavy and complete, broken only by the distant echo of footsteps fading away. I pulled back first, breath unsteady, already bracing for anger, for questions, for anything that would make sense of what I'd just done. But he only looked at me, really looked this time, like he was measuring something far more important than the situation we just escaped. "You just made a very expensive decision," he said quietly, his voice low but clear, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to carry weight. I swallowed, my fingers still gripping his jacket before I forced myself to let go. I didn't have a choice. He studied me for one long second, then glanced at the floor numbers climbing higher, like the direction suddenly mattered. "You always have a choice," he said, almost thoughtfully, before his gaze returned to mine, sharper now, more certain. "You just chose me." I didn't know his name yet. I didn't know what kind of world I had just stepped into. But as the elevator carried us upward, away from the storm and everything chasing me, I understood one thing with terrifying clarity. Surviving that moment might have just cost me everything else. Freedom is not the same as safety, and that was the first thing he taught me without even trying. The elevator doors opened into a hallway that did not feel like part of the same building I had run into. The noise of Manhattan reduced to nothing more than a distant hum, like the city had been sealed behind glass and left there, untouched and irrelevant, and I followed him without being told to, because the alternative was standing still and admitting I had no idea what came next. He did not look back to see if I was keeping up. He did not slow down, and somehow that made me move faster, like falling into step with him was the only way to stay anchored to something real. The hallway ended in a set of double doors that opened with a soft click as he approached. No keys, no hesitation, just access that existed because he expected it to. And when I stepped through behind him, I understood exactly how far out of my depth I was. Floor-to-ceiling windows stretched across the far wall, Central Park laid out below like something painted instead of real. The rain now nothing more than a quiet shimmer against the glass, and everything inside the space felt deliberate, expensive, controlled down to the smallest detail, from the dark wood floors to the low lighting that made the entire room feel like it belonged to someone who never needed to prove anything out loud. I stopped just inside the entrance, suddenly aware of how soaked I was, how out of place I looked standing there, dripping onto a floor that probably cost more than my entire apartment back in Queens, and for a second I thought about turning around, about finding the elevator again, about pretending none of this had happened, but the thought barely lasted a heartbeat. He walked past me, setting his jacket aside with a precision that felt almost ritualistic, then turned to face me fully for the first time since the elevator. "You should dry off," he said, like this was normal, like I had not just run into his life by accident. "There are towels in the bathroom to your left. No questions. No accusations. Just instructions." That unsettled me more than anything else could have. "That is it?" I asked, my voice still uneven, still catching on the edges of everything I was trying not to think about. "You are not going to ask me who I am?" He held my gaze, steady, unreadable. "Not yet." The answer landed heavier than if he had demanded everything at once. I did not move. "I need to leave," I said, forcing the words out before I could second-guess them. "Whatever you think this is, I am not staying here." He nodded once like he had expected that. "You can leave." Relief hit too quickly, too sharp, and I took a step toward the door before he spoke again. "If you walk out of here tonight, you will not make it 24 hours. My hand froze inches from the handle. Turned back slowly. "You do not know that." "I do," he said, calm, certain, not raising his voice, not stepping closer, just stating it like a fact that did not require belief to be true. "They saw you. They saw you with me. That changes things." The room felt smaller suddenly, like the air had shifted without warning. "Then call the police," I said, even though I already knew how that sounded, how thin it felt against everything that had just happened. He almost smiled, but not quite. "That will not help you." Of course it would not. Nothing about tonight had followed the rules I thought existed. I let my hand drop, my shoulders tightening as the reality settled in piece by piece. "So what, I stay here?" I asked, hating the way the question sounded, like I was already accepting it. "You stay where I can protect you," he corrected. And there it was again, not a threat, not a demand, just a statement that carried its own gravity. I searched his face for something I could push against, anger, arrogance, anything that would make this easier to fight, but all I found was control, the kind that did not need to prove itself because it never lost. "And if I do not trust you?" I asked quietly. He did not hesitate. "You do not have to trust me," he said. "You just have to decide if you trust them less." Silence stretched between us, heavy and undeniable, and for the first time since the elevator, I understood the truth I had been trying to outrun. I had not escaped anything. I had just traded one danger for another, and somehow, standing in that penthouse with the city spread out beneath me, I knew which one I was more afraid to face alone. The moment you start paying attention, you realize nothing in his world is accidental. I did not sleep that night, not really, just drifted in and out on a couch that felt too expensive to belong to someone like me, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly like detergent I could not name, while the city outside moved on without me, lights shifting, sirens echoing far below, reminding me that everything I had known was still out there, just no longer within reach. Morning came quietly, filtered through glass instead of curtains, and for a few seconds I forgot where I was until I sat up and saw the skyline stretching out like a reminder that I was very far from anything familiar. I stood slowly, my body stiff from tension more than exhaustion, and walked toward the kitchen where I found him already there, exactly where I expected and yet still somehow surprising, standing by the counter with a small porcelain cup in his hand, dark espresso untouched for the moment, like he had been awake long before the sun decided to show up. He glanced at me once, taking in everything without asking a single question, and then returned his attention to the city beyond the glass. "You did not try to leave," he said, not turning, not accusing, just stating something he had already confirmed. "The locks are not exactly subtle," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, and that was true because I had checked, not just the front door but every exit I could find, each one requiring access I did not have, each one quietly reminding me that his version of protection came with limits I could not ignore. He set the cup down, finally facing me fully, and for a moment neither of us spoke, the silence stretching long enough to feel intentional. Something close to control slipping back into my hands. Sartori. The name settled into the space between us like it belonged there. Vincent did not react immediately, and that silence told me more than any visible response could have. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter than before. You remember a lot for someone who was just passing through. I opened my eyes, meeting his gaze directly. I was not just passing through. That was the truth, or at least part of it, and I could see the moment he understood that there was more beneath the surface, more than I had given him, more than I was ready to say. He stepped closer, not enough to intimidate, just enough to close the distance between question and answer. You put yourself in that situation, he said, not accusing but confirming. Why? I held his gaze, my heart picking up in a way I could not fully control, because this was the line I had been avoiding, the one that would change everything once I crossed it. Because someone I care about disappeared, I said, my voice softer now, but stronger in a different way. And that name is the first real lead I have had in 6 months. He studied me for a long moment, weighing something I could not see, and then he nodded once, like a decision had been made somewhere behind that controlled exterior. Then you are not just a problem, he said. You are a complication. I let out a breath I had not realized I was holding. Is that worse? I asked. He picked up his espresso again, finally taking a sip before answering. That depends, he said calmly, on whether you are telling me the whole truth. And for the first time since I stepped into his world, I realized that surviving it was not going to be about running anymore. It was going to be about how long I could hold on to the parts of the truth that mattered most before he decided to take them from me himself. The truth is never what gets you in trouble. It is how long you wait to tell it. He did not look away from me after that, and I understood that whatever came next was not going to be optional, not in his world, not with the way he had already started connecting. Pieces I had tried to keep separate. I shifted my weight slightly, grounding myself again, because if I hesitated now, he would see it, and if he saw it, he would press harder, not with force but with that quiet persistence that made it impossible to hide behind half-answers. His name is Ethan, I said finally, letting the rest of it follow whether I was ready or not. My brother, 19. He disappeared 6 months ago. Vincent did not interrupt, did not react, just watched, giving me enough silence to keep going. No warning. No explanation. Just gone. I continued, my voice steady but tighter now, because saying it out loud always made it more real. The police called it a missing persons case. Said there was no sign of foul play. They told me to wait. I let out a short breath, not quite a laugh. Waiting does not work when you know something is wrong. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. So you stopped waiting. It was not a question. I started digging, I said. Bank records, phone logs, anything I could access through work. I am a paralegal, or I was. So I knew where to look and how to stay quiet about it. I met his eyes again, not backing down this time. That is how I found the shell companies. They all pointed back to the same logistics network. And that network led me to last night. He walked a few steps past me, slow, controlled, like he was mapping the information against something in his own mind, then stopped near the window, looking out over the city without really seeing it. And you decided to follow it alone, he said. I shrugged slightly. I did not have anyone else. That was the part that always landed the hardest. Not the danger, not the uncertainty, just the fact that no one had been coming to help me from the start. He turned back then, and something in his expression had shifted again, not softer, but more focused, like the situation had moved from abstract to personal in a way that mattered. Sartori is not a name you stumble into, he said. If your brother is connected to that network, then his disappearance is not random. I felt my chest tighten at that, because hearing it confirmed by someone like him made it harder to pretend. There might still be a simple explanation. I know, I said quietly. That is why I kept going. He studied me for a long second, then stepped closer, stopping just within reach but not touching, never crossing that line unless he chose to. If I help you, he said, his voice even deliberate, you do exactly what I say when I say it. No independent decisions. No disappearing on me. No more surprises. The terms landed between us like a contract already written. I held his gaze, feeling the weight of it, the cost of it, because this was not just about finding Ethan anymore. This was about stepping fully into his world and accepting whatever came with that. And in return? I asked. He did not hesitate. I find your brother, he said, and I make sure you stay alive long enough to see him again. There was no promise of anything beyond that. No comfort, no reassurance. Just the bare minimum framed in a way that somehow felt more honest than anything else I had heard in months. I nodded slowly, the decision forming not because I trusted him, but because I understood the alternative too well. Then we have a deal, I said. He watched me for another second, like he was confirming something deeper than my words, then gave a single nod in return. We do, he said. And just like that, everything shifted again because this time I was not being kept there. This time I was choosing to stay, and I had the feeling that decision was going to matter far more than the one I made in that elevator. Sometimes the second time you are saved, it is not as clean as the first. We left just after sunrise, when the city still felt half asleep and the streets had not fully filled with noise yet, and for a moment it almost felt normal, like I was just another person getting into a car, heading somewhere I could explain if anyone asked, except nothing about this was normal, and I could feel it in the way the driver did not speak, in the way the route changed twice before we even crossed into Brooklyn, in the way Vincent sat beside me in silence, watching everything without looking like he was watching anything at all. I kept my eyes on the window, memorizing turns. Without meaning to, counting seconds between lights, tracking patterns the same way I had taught myself to do months ago when everything started to fall apart. Because if I was going to survive this, I needed to understand it, not just follow it. Where are we going? I asked finally, breaking the quiet. Somewhere your lead might actually mean something, he replied, not looking at me. His attention fixed somewhere beyond the glass, like the answer was already waiting for us there. The buildings changed as we moved deeper into the warehouse district, taller structures giving way to wide industrial blocks, metal doors, faded signs, the kind of place that looked forgotten until you noticed how many cameras were actually pointed at the street. The car slowed, then stopped behind a row of shipping containers stacked 3 high, and before I could ask anything else, the door opened and one of his men stepped forward, scanning the area with a precision that made my chest tighten without fully understanding why. Vincent stepped out first, then glanced back at me. Stay close, he said, and this time it was not a suggestion. I followed him, the air colder here, sharper, carrying the scent of metal and rain that had not fully dried, and everything felt too quiet, like the space was holding its breath. We moved between the containers, narrow paths creating blind corners that made me instinctively slow down, but he did not hesitate, and somehow that made me keep moving forward even when every instinct told me to stop. This is where your trail leads? He asked over his shoulder. The company that owns these units is linked to the accounts I found, I said, my voice lower now, matching the tone of the place around us. It is not proof, but it is not nothing. He nodded once, acknowledging it, and then everything shifted in a way I could not explain at first, just a feeling, a change in the air that made the back of my neck tighten. The man ahead of us paused, his posture changing slightly, and Vincent stopped instantly, one hand moving just enough to signal something I did not understand but immediately obeyed, because I froze where I was without needing to be told twice. Silence pressed in, heavier now, and I realized how loud my breathing sounded in my own ears. We are not alone, Vincent said quietly, not turning, not raising his voice, just stating it like a fact that had already been confirmed. My pulse spiked, my thoughts racing too fast to organize, because this was exactly what I had been trying to avoid and exactly what I had walked into anyway. Something moved at the far end of the row, too quick to fully catch, and then everything happened at once, not chaos, not confusion, but controlled motion unfolding faster than I could track, voices low and sharp, footsteps shifting positions, the space suddenly no longer empty. I felt Vincent's hand close around my wrist, firm, steady, pulling me back just enough to keep me behind him. Not rough, not panicked, just precise, like he had done this before more times than I could count. Stay with me, he said, and this time there was no room for argument. I nodded, even though he could not see it, my focus narrowing to the sound of his voice, the pressure of his grip, the only 2 things that felt stable in a moment that had tilted sideways without warning. Seconds stretched longer than they should have, and then just as quickly as it had begun, the tension broke, footsteps retreating, the presence that had surrounded us pulling back like it had never fully intended to stay. Vincent did not move immediately, did not release me, waiting, counting something I could not see, and when he finally turned to look at me, there was something different in his expression, something sharper, more certain. "They were expecting someone," he said. "Just not us." My heart was still racing, my mind trying to catch up to everything that had just happened. "So what does that mean?" I asked. He held my gaze for a second longer than usual before answering. "It means your brother is closer to this than we thought," he said. "And it means someone else already knows we are looking." And just like that, the deal I had made felt heavier, more real, because this was no longer just about finding Ethan. Now it was about who else was already waiting for us to try. The most dangerous choices are the ones you pretend were accidents. We did not go back to the penthouse right away, and that alone told me everything had changed, because before, every move Vincent made felt controlled, contained, part of a structure I could not see but could still sense, and now there was something sharper in the way he gave instructions, something faster, like whatever we had walked into back there had forced the timeline forward whether we were ready or not. The car moved through Brooklyn without stopping, then across the bridge, the skyline rising again in front of us, but it did not feel the same as it had that morning, because now I knew someone else was watching, someone who already understood more about me than I was comfortable admitting. Vincent had not spoken since we left the warehouse, not to me, not to anyone, just short, precise directions to the driver that did not invite conversation, and I found myself studying him instead. The way his posture had shifted slightly, the way his focus seemed narrower, more intense, like he was already 3 steps ahead of whatever came next. "You knew this could happen?" I said finally, breaking the silence that had stretched too long. He did not look at me. "I knew it was possible," he corrected. "There is a difference." I let that sit for a second, then leaned back slightly, crossing my arms as I watched the city pass by. "You said Sartori is not a name you stumble into," I said. "So what exactly did I walk into?" This time he did look at me, and there was no hesitation in his expression now, no distance, just direct assessment. "A network that does not leave loose ends," he said. "And you made yourself one." The words should have scared me more than they did, but instead they settled into place alongside everything else I had already accepted. "I was already a loose end," I said quietly, "before I ever stepped into that hotel." His gaze sharpened at that, just slightly. "Explain." I held his eyes, knowing this was the moment where I either kept playing safe or I stepped fully into the truth I had been holding back. "That night in the elevator," I said slowly, "I did not just pick you because you were there." He did not move, but the space between us felt tighter, more focused. "I recognized you." Silence. Not empty. Waiting. I continued before I could second-guess it. "My mother kept a photograph," I said. "Not my real mother. The one who raised me. She never talked about where it came from, but I remember it clearly. You were younger, standing next to a man I later found connected to the same network I have been tracking." His expression did not change, but something in his eyes did. Something colder, more precise. "And you decided to approach me," he said. "Not a question. I decided you were the fastest way into a world I could not access on my own," I replied, my voice steady even as my pulse picked up. "I did not expect the situation in the elevator, but when I saw you, I knew exactly who you were." The car slowed slightly as we hit traffic, but neither of us noticed. The air inside felt heavier now, charged with something that had not been there before. "So the kiss," he said, his tone even, controlled. "That was not just survival." I shook my head once. "It was survival," I said. "Just not only that." He held my gaze for a long second, long enough that I could feel the weight of everything I had just admitted settling into place, changing the dynamic between us in a way that could not be undone. "You used me," he said finally, not angry, not raised, just stating it as clearly as he had stated everything else since I met him. "I chose you," I corrected, "because that mattered, because there was a difference, even if it was a small one." Something almost unreadable crossed his expression, gone before I could name it. "Most people who make that choice do not understand the cost," he said. "I think you do." I did not answer right away because the truth was I did not know the full cost yet, not really, but I knew enough to stay where I was instead of pulling back. If I did not, I said quietly, I would not still be here. The car came to a stop outside the building, the same controlled environment waiting for us on the other side of the glass, but nothing about it felt the same anymore. Vincent opened the door, stepping out before offering me a hand, not to help, but to guide, and as I took it, I realized something that should have been obvious from the start. I had not just entered his world by accident. I had stepped into it on purpose. And now that he knew that, there was no version of this where he would ever let me walk out of it easily. The most unsettling part about him was not what he did. It was what he chose not to do. The penthouse felt different when we walked back in, not because anything had changed physically, but because now I understood that every silence between us was intentional, every unanswered question was a decision, and every moment he allowed to pass without control was a kind of control on its own. I let go of his hand the second we stepped inside, not out of defiance but because I needed to remind myself where I ended and his world began, and for a brief second I expected him to stop me, to pull me back into that invisible boundary he had drawn around me since the elevator, but he did not, and that almost threw me more than if he had. He moved past me, removing his jacket with the same measured precision as before, placing it exactly where it belonged, as if nothing we had just uncovered mattered enough to disrupt the order of his space. "You should eat," he said, glancing toward the kitchen. "You have not eaten since yesterday." I frowned slightly, caught off guard. "You noticed that?" He gave a small, almost dismissive shrug. "I notice everything." That much I believed. I walked toward the counter slowly, the weight of the day settling into my body now that the adrenaline had faded, and found a plate already prepared. Something simple but carefully arranged, like even the smallest details in his world were handled with intention. I hesitated before sitting down. "You do this for everyone you bring here?" I asked, half expecting him to ignore the question. He poured another cup of espresso before answering. "I do not bring people here." The words landed quietly, but they carried more meaning than anything else he had said since we met. I looked at him then, really looked, searching for something behind the control, something human enough to make sense of the contradiction he had become in my mind. "Then why me?" I asked. He did not answer right away, and for a moment I thought he might not answer at all, but then he leaned slightly against the counter, his gaze settling on me in a way that felt more direct than before. "Because you stepped into something most people spend their entire lives avoiding," he said. "And you did it on purpose." I let out a quiet breath, nodding once, because there was no point denying that now. "And that makes me worth keeping around?" I asked. There was a flicker of something in his expression, gone before I could fully catch it. "It makes you relevant," he said. "For now." That should have felt cold, but instead it felt honest, and I realized I trusted honesty more than comfort at this point. I picked up the fork, forcing myself to eat even though my appetite had not fully returned, and the normalcy of the action grounded me in a way nothing else had all day. "You said you do not repeat the mistakes that built you," I said after a moment, recalling something he had said earlier. "What mistake are you avoiding now?" He went still for just a second, not enough for anyone else to notice, but I saw it, the shift, the hesitation he did not allow to surface fully. "The kind that costs more than money," he said finally. It was not an answer, not really, but it was closer than anything else he had given me, and for some reason that mattered more than I expected. The room fell quiet again, but it was different this time, less tense, more aware, like we had crossed some invisible line neither of us had acknowledged out loud. I finished eating slowly, setting the fork down as I studied him again. This man who controlled everything around him but seemed to choose carefully what parts of himself he let exist in front of me. "You could have left me in that elevator," I said softly. "You did not have to get involved." He met my gaze without hesitation. "You made that impossible the moment you chose me," he said. There was no accusation in it, just fact, and somehow that made it harder to argue with. I leaned back slightly, absorbing that, the weight of my own decision settling deeper than before, and for the first time since this all started, I understood something that had been building quietly beneath everything else. He was not just keeping me here because he had to. He was keeping me here because he had decided to, and that was a difference I was not sure I knew how to navigate yet. The moment trust becomes a question, everything else starts to feel like a lie. It did not happen all at once, not in some dramatic shift or obvious crack, but in the small details that stopped lining up the way they should have, in the way the air inside the penthouse felt just slightly different the next morning, like something unseen had already moved through it before I woke up. I noticed it in the silence first, not the calm kind that Vincent controlled, but something tighter, thinner, like a held breath that had not been released yet. He was already dressed when I stepped into the main room, phone in his hand, voice low and measured as he spoke in Italian. Words I could not fully understand, but tone I could, and whatever was being said on the other end was not good. He ended the call the moment he saw me, not abruptly, just decisively, like I did not need to hear the rest. Something changed, I said, because pretending otherwise would have been pointless. He studied me for a second, then nodded once. Yes. No details. No explanation. Just confirmation that my instincts were not wrong. Does it have to do with yesterday? I pressed. He walked past me toward the window, his reflection sharp against the glass, the city stretching out beneath him like something he owned but did not trust. It has to do with information that should not have been shared, he said. That made my chest tighten. Meaning? He turned then, and there was no softness in his expression now, only calculation. Meaning someone knew where we were going before we got there. The words landed heavier than anything else he had said so far, because they did not just point outward, they pointed inward. That is not possible, I said automatically, even though part of me already knew it was. Only your people knew about that location. Exactly, he replied. Silence stretched between us, and this time it was different, sharper, filled with something that did not belong to either of us alone. So someone on your side is feeding information, I said slowly, forcing the conclusion into words. He did not deny it. That is the most likely explanation. I shook my head slightly, trying to process that, because if that was true, then everything around me was less stable than I had allowed myself to believe. You trust them, I said. You would not have built all of this if you did not. His gaze held mine, steady and unflinching. Trust is not the same as certainty, he said. Before I could respond, the elevator opened with a soft chime, and a man stepped into the penthouse without hesitation, moving with the kind of familiarity that told me he belonged there. Marco D'Angelo. I recognized him immediately from the way Vincent had mentioned him before, from the way the security outside did not even glance in his direction, and from the way he carried himself like someone who did not need permission to exist in this space. He stopped a few feet away, his expression composed but alert, his eyes flicking briefly to me before returning to Vincent. We need to talk, Marco said, his voice calm but edged with something I could not fully place. Vincent did not move. We are talking, he replied. Marco's gaze shifted back to me, lingering just a second too long, and for the first time since I met him, I felt something close to discomfort that had nothing to do with fear. It was recognition, not of me, but of the situation I represented. Not like this, Marco said quietly. Vincent did not look away from him. There is no version of this where she is not involved, he said. That landed harder than I expected, not because of what it meant, but because of how easily he said it, like it was already decided. Marco exhaled slowly, then nodded once, as if accepting a condition he did not fully agree with. The location yesterday, he said, his tone shifting, more direct now. It was compromised before you even left Manhattan. Vincent's expression did not change, but I saw the moment the confirmation locked into place. Source? He asked. Marco hesitated just for a fraction of a second, but I saw it, and something about that hesitation did not sit right with me. Still tracing it, he said. But it is internal. The room went quiet again, heavier this time, because now the possibility was no longer a theory, it was a fact waiting to be named. I looked between them, something cold settling into my chest as the realization formed slowly but clearly. If someone inside your circle is leaking information, I said carefully, then whoever took Ethan already knows we are getting closer. That were impossible to miss this time, and before I could move, Vincent turned slightly toward me. Stay behind me, he said, not because I did not already know, but because this time the stakes were different. I nodded, my hands steady even as my heart began to race, and followed him out into the cold air that carried the scent of rain and metal, the same as before, but heavier now, more final. Everything moved quickly after that, not chaotic, not loud, just efficient, like everyone already knew exactly where they needed to be, and I stayed close to Vincent, close enough to feel the presence of him without needing to look, grounding myself in that as we moved through the building and into a space that felt colder than the rest. Then I saw him. For a second, my brain refused to process it, like the image in front of me did not match the memory I had been holding onto for 6 months. But then it clicked into place all at once, and the air left my lungs in a way that felt like I had been holding it this entire time without realizing it. "Ethan," I said, the name breaking out of me before I could stop it. He was there, sitting, alive. Not the way I remembered, not the same energy, not the same light in his eyes, but unmistakably him. I moved before anyone could stop me, crossing the distance in seconds, dropping to my knees in front of him as my hands hovered for just a moment before I finally let myself touch him. Like if I moved too fast he might disappear again. "It is me," I said, my voice shaking now, unable to hold the control I had managed for so long. "I am here." His eyes lifted slowly, unfocused at first, then narrowing slightly as if trying to place me through layers of something I could not see. "Clara," he said, barely above a whisper, but enough, more than enough to shatter whatever walls I had built to get through this. Relief hit me hard, sharp, overwhelming, and for a moment everything else disappeared. The danger, the questions, the world Vincent belonged to, all of it fading into the background as I focused on the only thing that mattered. He was alive. I stayed there with him, speaking softly, grounding him the way I had learned to ground myself, reminding him where he was, who I was, pulling him back piece by piece until his breathing steadied slightly and his gaze locked onto mine with more clarity than before. Behind me, I could feel Vincent's presence, still, watchful, giving me space without stepping away, and that mattered more than I could explain. "You are safe now," I said quietly, even though I was not sure if that was true yet. Ethan's hand tightened slightly around mine, and for a second I thought that was all he had to give. But then his expression shifted, something flickering behind his eyes that did not belong to relief. It belonged to fear. "No," he said softly, shaking his head just once. "Not safe." My chest tightened instantly. "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning closer. His gaze flicked past me for a split second, toward Vincent, then back to me, like he was deciding something he did not have time to fully understand. "Cross," he whispered. The name meant nothing to me. Not yet. But the way he said it, the way his voice dropped, the way his grip on my hand tightened like it was the only thing anchoring him in place, told me everything I needed to know. We had found him. But whatever he had been running from was still out there. And now it had a name. "The most dangerous enemies are the ones you were never supposed to see." The name stayed with me long after Ethan said it, echoing in a way that did not make sense yet but refused to fade. And as we moved him out of that building and into the car, I could feel the shift in everything around us, like the world had quietly expanded beyond what I thought I was dealing with. Vincent sat across from us, his attention fixed not just on Ethan but on every word, every reaction, every pause that might mean more than it seemed, and for the first time since I met him, I saw something close to tension in the way he held himself, not fear, but recognition of something larger than the situation we had just walked into. "Who is Cross?" I asked, my voice low as I kept one hand wrapped around Ethan's, grounding him as best as I could. Ethan shook his head slightly, like even the question cost him something. "He is not supposed to be part of this," he said, his voice uneven but clearer than before. Vincent leaned forward slightly, his focus narrowing. "Explain." Ethan swallowed, his gaze flicking between us like he was trying to decide how much he could say out loud. "I saw something," he said. "Not just shipments, not just names, files, records that should not exist." My grip tightened instinctively. "What kind of records?" I asked. Ethan hesitated again, then looked directly at Vincent, as if recognizing something in him that made the truth easier to say. "Government contracts," he said. "But not the kind you read about. The kind that erase things. People. Evidence." The words settled into the space between us, heavier than anything that had come before, because they did not just point to a criminal network, they pointed to something that existed above it, around it, controlling it without ever being seen. Vincent's expression did not change, but I could feel the shift in his attention, the way he was already moving pieces in his head. "And Cross?" he asked. Ethan exhaled slowly, his voice dropping. "He is the one who makes sure nothing comes back," he said. Silence followed, thick and undeniable, and for the first time since this all started, I felt something colder than fear settle into my chest. "You are saying this is not just about Sartori," I said, more to myself than to either of them. Vincent answered anyway. "No," he said quietly. "It is not." The car slowed as we crossed back into Manhattan, the city rising around us again like it always had, unchanged, unaware, and that somehow made it worse, because everything looked the same even though nothing was. "Then why is Sartori involved at all?" I asked. Vincent leaned back slightly, his gaze distant for a moment as he considered it. "Because people like Sartori are useful," he said. "They operate where others cannot. They take risks that keep attention away from the real source." I looked down at Ethan, at the way his hand still held onto mine like letting go was not an option. "And you saw something they could not let exist," I said softly. He nodded once. "I was not supposed to understand it," he admitted. "But I did." Vincent's eyes returned to him, sharper now. "Do you still have access to what you saw?" Ethan hesitated, then gave a small nod. "Not directly," he said, "but I remember enough." That was when everything shifted again, not in the world around us, but in the space inside the car, in the understanding that we were no longer chasing a missing person case or even a criminal network. We were standing at the edge of something that had been carefully hidden for a long time. I met Vincent's gaze, searching for something that might tell me how far this went, how dangerous it had just become. "This is bigger than you," I said. He held my gaze unflinching. "Yes," he said, "but that does not mean I walk away." I believed him. That was the problem. Because for the first time since I stepped into his world, I realized the danger was no longer just about what I had chosen. It was about what he was now choosing too. And if someone like Vincent Moretti decided to go against something like this, then whatever Cross was, whatever he represented, was not just watching anymore. It was going to respond. Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to become the thing they cannot follow. The city felt quieter that night, or maybe it was just me, the way everything inside my head had slowed down enough to make every thought sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore, because now I understood what we were really standing in the middle of, and it was not something you simply survived by staying close to the strongest person in the room. Ethan was asleep in the next room, finally resting in a way that looked real, not forced, and I stood by the window staring out at the same skyline that had felt so distant just days ago, trying to figure out where the line was between staying and becoming part of something I could not control. Vincent was behind me. I could feel it without turning, the quiet presence that had become familiar in a way I did not fully trust yet. "You are thinking too much," he said, his voice low, not dismissive, just certain. I let out a small breath. "That seems to be the only thing keeping me alive lately," I replied. He stepped closer, not enough to touch, just enough to close the distance in a way that made the space feel smaller. "Overthinking leads to hesitation," he said. "Hesitation gets people hurt." I turned then, meeting his gaze directly. "So does staying in the wrong place," I said. That caught his attention, the shift immediate, subtle but unmistakable. "What are you saying?" he asked. I held his gaze even though everything in me wanted to look away, because this was the part that mattered, the part that was going to change everything whether I was ready or not. "I am saying this does not end if I stay here," I said. "It escalates." His expression hardened slightly. "It escalates whether you stay or not," he replied. "At least here, I can control it." I shook my head once. "No, you cannot," I said quietly. "Not this. Not something like Cross." Silence fell between us again, heavier than before, because now we were not talking about survival anymore. We were talking about choices that had consequences neither of us could fully contain. "You think leaving will make you safer," he said. It was not a question. I think leaving might make you less of a target, I corrected. That landed harder than I expected, because I saw it in his eyes, the moment the idea connected in a way he could not dismiss. This is not about me, he said. It became about you the moment I stepped into that elevator, I replied. And now it is about Ethan too. I took a small step back, creating space I knew I was about to need. They are not just watching me anymore, I continued. They are watching you because of me. He did not deny it. That was the problem. So you run, he said, his tone tightening slightly for the first time. That is your solution. No, I said. I move. The distinction mattered, even if he did not agree with it. Running is reacting, I added. This is choosing. His gaze held mine, searching for something, maybe a flaw in my logic, maybe a reason to stop me. But I had already made the decision before I said any of this out loud. If I stay, I said softer now, you will keep pulling this closer to you and they will respond. And when they do, it will not just be about control anymore. He stepped closer then, just enough that I could feel the shift. In the air between us. And you think I will just let you walk out of here? He said quietly. I met his gaze without flinching. I think you will understand why I have to try, I said. That was the truth, the only one I could offer him. Silence stretched, longer this time, heavier, like the entire city had paused just to see what he would say next. But he did not answer right away, and that told me everything I needed to know, because Vincent Moretti did not hesitate unless something actually mattered. I turned back to the window, giving him the space to decide whatever he was going to decide, but inside, the choice was already made. Because the first time I stepped into his world, it was to survive. This time, I was stepping out of it for the exact same reason. Just not for me alone anymore. The most dangerous plan is the one that looks like surrender. I did not leave immediately, not in a rush, not in a way that would make it obvious, because if there was one thing I had learned from Vincent, it was that timing mattered more than intention, and if I was going to step out of his world, I had to do it in a way that did not trigger everything watching us to react all at once. The penthouse remained quiet, controlled, almost unchanged on the surface, but underneath it I could feel the shift, the movement of decisions being made without words, the way Vincent's presence became sharper, more focused, like he had already accepted that I was going to try something and was choosing how far he would allow it to go. He did not stop me when I packed a small bag, did not question what I took or what I left behind, and somehow that was more unsettling than if he had blocked the door, because it meant he was already planning around my choice instead of fighting it directly. You will not be alone, he said at one point, his voice calm but firm as I zipped the bag closed. That is not part of this. I met his gaze, understanding exactly what he meant without needing him to say it out loud. Then do not make it obvious, I replied. Because if they see your protection, they will not come close enough. His eyes narrowed slightly, not in anger, but in calculation. You are assuming they will come at all, he said. I shook my head once. No, I said quietly. I am assuming they already are. That was the truth we had both accepted without saying it directly. This was not about drawing attention anymore. It was about controlling how it arrived. Ethan remained asleep, and I stood by his door for a moment longer than I should have, watching him breathe steadily, grounding myself in the one reason I could not afford to hesitate now. He stays here, Vincent said behind me. It was not a suggestion. He is safer with you than anywhere else. I agreed, and that was the part that made everything harder, because I was trusting him with the one person I had spent months trying to find, and I did not have the luxury of second-guessing that decision anymore. When I finally turned to leave, the city outside felt colder than before, sharper, like it had been waiting for this moment to become something else entirely. The car that picked me up was not one I recognized, and that was intentional, another layer in a plan that was already unfolding around me whether I fully understood it or not. I sat in the back seat, watching the streets pass by, forcing myself to stay calm, to stay present, because this was no longer about reacting to what happened next. It was about shaping it. Somewhere behind me, Vincent was moving pieces into place. I could feel it even without seeing it, the way everything had aligned too smoothly for this to be anything but deliberate. He was not letting me go. He was letting the situation come to us. The realization settled in slowly but completely. This was not escape. It was strategy. I leaned back slightly, my fingers tightening around the edge of my bag as the car turned onto a quieter street. The kind of place where attention was easier to control and harder to trace. And for a moment everything felt suspended, like the world had paused just long enough to let whatever came next arrive exactly when it was meant to. A figure stepped into view near the corner. Not rushed, not hidden, just present in a way that felt intentional. And even before the car slowed, I knew this was it, the moment we had been moving toward since Ethan said that name. Cross. Not a face I recognized, not yet. But the weight of it was already there, pressing in from all sides as the car came to a stop and the distance between us closed to something unavoidable. I opened the door slowly, stepping out into the cold air that carried the faint echo of the city behind it. And for the first time since I made the decision to leave, I felt something steady settle in beneath everything else. Not fear, not hesitation, control. Because this time I was not running into something unknown. I was walking directly toward it, knowing exactly what it could cost and choosing it anyway. In the end, it was never about who had the most power. It was about who was willing to stand still when everything else moved. The man standing in front of me did not look like what I expected, and that was the first thing that told me Ethan had been right, because real control never announces itself the way people imagine it does. It does not arrive with noise or intimidation, it simply exists calm and certain, like the world has already adjusted around it. "Clara Bennett," he said, my name sounding too familiar in his voice, like he had been expecting this moment long before I stepped out of that car. "You made this easier than I thought you would." I held his gaze steady, refusing to give him anything he had not already taken. "You were already watching," I replied. "I just decided not to hide anymore." There was a flicker of something in his expression. Not surprise, not quite approval, but recognition of a move he had not anticipated in exactly that way. "Your brother was not supposed to be a problem," he said. "But curiosity tends to create complications." I felt the words land, but I did not let them settle. "You mean he saw something you could not erase?" I said. His smile was small, controlled. "Something like that." The street around us remained quiet, almost too quiet, but I could feel it now, the invisible lines, the positioning of people I could not see. The sense that this conversation was not happening in isolation no matter how it looked. "You built something that depends on people not asking questions," I continued. "That works until someone does." His eyes sharpened slightly. "And you think asking those questions puts you in a position of strength?" he asked. "No," I said honestly. "I think it puts me in a position where you have to respond." That was the difference, and I could see the moment he understood that I knew it. Silence stretched, but it was not empty, it was full of calculation, of decisions being made faster than words could keep up with, and for a second I wondered how far this would go before something shifted beyond control. Then it did. Not in a way that broke the moment, but in a way that redefined it completely. A car door closed somewhere behind me, soft, precise, followed by footsteps that did not rush, did not hesitate, just approached with the kind of certainty I had come to recognize. I did not turn right away. I did not need to. "You should have stayed out of this," Cross said, his attention shifting past me before I even moved. That was when I turned. Vincent stood a few feet behind me, exactly where I knew he would be, not because he had followed me, but because he had never let this unfold without him being part of it. His expression was calm, controlled, the same as always, but there was something different beneath it now, something quieter and far more dangerous than anything I had seen before. "You should not have touched what was not yours to control," Vincent replied, his voice even measured, carrying without needing volume. Cross exhaled slowly, his gaze moving between us like he was reassessing the entire situation in real time. "You think this ends in your favor," he said. Vincent did not look at him. He looked at me. "It already has," he said quietly. And in that moment I understood what he meant, because this was never about winning the way Cross defined it. It was about exposure, about forcing something hidden into the open where it could not operate the same way anymore. The balance had shifted, not through force, but through visibility, through the simple fact that this was no longer contained. Cross saw it too, I could tell, the way his expression tightened just slightly, not in fear, but in recognition that the structure he relied on had been disrupted. In a way he could not immediately fix. "This is not over," he said. Vincent's gaze never left mine. "It never is," he replied. Silence followed, but this time it felt different. Lighter in a way I had not felt since this all began. Like something had finally released its grip just enough for me to breathe without counting every second. Cross stepped back first, not retreating, but recalculating, and within moments he was gone, the street returning to its quiet, controlled stillness as if nothing had happened at all. I let out a slow breath, my hands steady for the first time in days, then turned fully toward Vincent. For a second, neither of us spoke, because there was nothing left to explain, nothing left to negotiate, just the space between us and everything we had stepped through to get here. "The first time," I said softly, "I kissed you because I did not have another option." He watched me, silent. I took a step closer. "This time," I continued, my voice steadier than I expected, "I do." I reached for him, not out of fear, not out of necessity, but because I chose to, closing the distance on my own terms, and when I kissed him again it was different, slower, certain in a way the first one could never have been. He did not stop me. He did not question it. He simply let it happen, and in that moment, for the first time since all of this started, nothing felt like survival anymore. Felt like a decision.